My name is Mahir. 2 months ago, I found a video on your channel, the one about the former imam who couldn't finish his prayer. I had no intention of watching it. I clicked it by accident. But once it started, I didn't blink for 7 minutes. Something about the way he sat in silence, as if someone had stolen his breath. That image stayed with me. So I'm writing this, because I think it's my turn now. I was a teacher, a quiet man, well-pressed, well-spoken, and always on time. People listened when I talked. I never raised my voice. I didn't need to. My students wrote my words down. Imams nodded when I passed. My father would introduce me at gatherings with a smile that carried decades of pride. "My son," he'd say. He never once skipped Fajr. That was true. I believed. Or at least I tried to. Belief, for me, was obedience wrapped in habit. I didn't question. I taught. I memorized. I led prayer. I knew how to pause in just the right place when reciting. I knew how to fold grief behind my tone. But beneath all of it, there was a kind of static, a buzz I couldn't mute. My wife noticed once. We were in the kitchen. I forgot to respond when she called my name. I was just standing there, staring at the tile. She laughed softly, touched my arm, and said, "You're somewhere else again." I smiled. Just tired. But I wasn't tired. I was blank, like someone who knows the lines of a song but forgets what the words mean. My life was structured, clean, predictable. But then, there was that girl, the one who came to me after class, eyes wet, asking what to do if her fiancé had started reading. Other books. She didn't say what kind. I told her gently to pray for him. But then she said something strange. He told me he felt peace, but not from us. I froze. I don't know why that sentence unsettled me. Her story shouldn't have mattered. But somehow, it clung to me like a secret I hadn't uncovered yet. That night, I sat in my study, pulled down an old volume, and tried to read, but the words blurred. My hands were cold. I found myself replaying her sentence in my mind, again and again, like a chant I didn't choose. Peace, but not from us. I went to sleep late. In the dream, I stood at the front of the prayer hall, leading the evening recitation. But my voice wouldn't rise. My lips moved, but no sound came out. No one noticed. They just kept following, bowing, prostrating, chanting, and I was there, silent, mouthing holy words into a vacuum. I woke with my heart pounding and my throat dry. I drank water slowly, watching the reflection of the hallway light shake inside the glass. That moment cracked something open in me. I didn't know what it meant. But what came next? I was not ready for it. It was an ordinary morning, the kind where nothing new is expected and everything follows a familiar rhythm. I arrived at the seminary before the sun, as I always did, letting the weight of ritual settle on my shoulders like an old, well-worn coat. The courtyard was still cool from the night. A single bird sang from the gatepost, and the scent of stone and dust rose around my steps. I remember that morning more clearly than others, not because something obvious happened, but because of what began to break, silently, invisibly, beneath the surface. The lesson was on jurisprudence. I sat before my small group of students, men in their 20s, bright-eyed, sharp-tongued, eager to impress. I had taught this material a dozen times before. I knew where they'd stumble, where they'd pretend to understand, and where they'd nod simply because nodding looked obedient. That day, we discussed accountability and mercy, how, when, and for whom they applied. I used the old stories, the clear arguments, the verses we all knew by heart. Everything in my tone was measured, clean, confident. But something felt off. A dryness in my mouth, a pressure in my temples. I was too aware of my voice, as if I were listening to myself from outside my own body. And then the question came. One of the students, quiet and soft-spoken, Yusef, I think, raised his hand hesitantly. He never interrupted. He barely spoke at all. But that morning, he looked straight at me and asked, "Teacher, what if someone does everything right, but deep down they're only doing it out of fear? Does it still count?" I laughed softly, trying to deflect the tension. "Fear is part of reverence," I said. "It keeps us from arrogance." "But what if it's only fear?" he pressed. "What if someone prays, fasts, obeys, but never feels peace?" There was a pause. My chest tightened. The others shifted awkwardly. A few smirked. One glanced at me nervously. I felt their eyes waiting for my correction. "You're overthinking," I replied, keeping my voice even. "Sometimes peace is in the doing, not in the feeling." But the air in the room had changed. I could sense it, as if something unspoken had been dragged into the center, something heavy and unwelcome. I moved the lesson forward, more rigid than before. The students followed, but the light in their eyes dimmed. Yusef didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The silence he left behind was louder than anything he could have said. After they left, I sat alone at my desk, staring at the wooden surface, my fingers tracing the edges. That question kept circling in my mind like a trapped bird. I told myself it was irrelevant, but it wasn't. It was real. And it had found something inside me that I had worked very hard to keep buried. Later that week, I gave a lecture at a private gathering. Elders, scholars, family friends. The kind of event where people spoke more with their eyebrows than with their voices. I was asked to speak on the resilience of faith. I prepared my notes meticulously, recited the key passages twice, polished every word. But as I stood to speak, I noticed my father watching me from the second row. His hands were folded, his face unreadable, and suddenly I wasn't sure who I was speaking for: God, the audience, or him. I stumbled slightly mid-sentence, just enough for a few people to notice. A pause that wasn't part of the script. I recovered quickly, smiled, and continued. But inside, something sank, like a thread snapping. I felt my father's gaze tighten just for a second. A slight tilt of his head. Disappointment, suspicion, maybe nothing at all. But it cut through me like a cold draft through heavy curtains. Afterwards, as we gathered for tea, one of the guests, a respected elder I had known since childhood, pulled me aside. "You seem distracted lately," he said quietly, not unkindly. "Is everything all right?" I smiled. "Just tired. Too much reading." He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. "Be careful what you read. Not every book keeps you inside the fold." I laughed politely, but my stomach turned. I hadn't read anything forbidden. Not yet. But I had thought, I had allowed myself to wonder. And in this world, sometimes wondering was worse than reading. I walked home alone that evening, despite the offers of a ride. The streets were dim, lined with shuttered stalls and the faint scent of spices clinging to the air. I passed a small bookstore, closed, and found myself staring at the display window. Among the usual texts, one caught my eye. The title wasn't in Arabic. I couldn't even pronounce it. But the cover showed a man sitting beneath a tree, looking up at the sky. Something in his posture looked free. I didn't go inside, but I stood there longer than I should have. That night, I tried to pray. I stood on the rug, facing the right direction, whispering the words I had spoken since I was a child. But something in me held back. I paused. My mind wandered. I kept returning to that boy's question, and then to my own reflection in the window. I didn't like what I saw. I tried again. I began the opening verses, forcing my breath into rhythm, but my voice cracked. Midway through the second line, my mouth went dry. I swallowed, tried again. Nothing came. I sat down, staring at the rug. I couldn't finish the prayer. The next day, Yusuf didn't return to class. No explanation, no warning. When I asked the administration, they said only, "His father withdrew him. He's being sent elsewhere." Elsewhere. I knew what that meant. I didn't ask further. That evening, I received a message from an unknown number. Just one sentence. "Be careful, Mahir. People are listening." I didn't reply. I deleted it, then emptied the trash folder. But my hands were shaking for almost an hour. The air felt heavier that day, as if something was about to ask me a question I wasn't ready to answer. I thought I could walk away, but I had no idea what was waiting around the corner. It started with my sleep. I used to rest easily. My days were full, my rituals exact, and my mind, though often busy, had been trained to obey a certain rhythm. But after that message, short, anonymous, enough to make me check over my shoulder even in my own hallway, the nights stopped being quiet. The first dream came 3 days later. In it, I was walking through a long corridor lined with bookshelves. The light overhead flickered. I knew the place. It was a corridor at the seminary. But somehow, it felt wrong. The books were blank, no titles, no markings, just rows and rows of emptiness. As I walked, I heard my own footsteps echo too loudly. Then, a voice behind me whispered my name. Not angrily, not even loudly, just a whisper. "Mahir." I turned. No one. I woke up with my heart racing and my shirt clinging to my back. It was 3:41 a.m. I got up, washed, and went to pray. I tried to steady my breath. I tried to remember what came after the second verse. My tongue fumbled. I sat back on my heels and stared at the floor for a long time. That was the first time I noticed it. I could recite scripture in front of hundreds. I could speak eloquently for hours. But alone in the dark, in silence, I couldn't finish a single prayer. Not without forgetting, not without stumbling, not without that buzzing in my head. In the morning, I avoided my wife's gaze. She poured tea, like always, soft and quiet. But she noticed. I saw it in the pause of her hand, the way she set the cup down too carefully. "You had that dream again, didn't you?" she asked. I froze. What dream? Her voice barely rose above the sound of the kettle. You've been mumbling in your sleep, saying someone's name. I don't know who. I laughed, or tried to. Probably just a student. I've been under pressure. She didn't press further, but she didn't smile either. That afternoon, I met with one of the elders from the seminary. He wanted to review the syllabus for the upcoming semester. We sat in his office, a heavy room that always smelled faintly of incense and worn leather. The shelves were filled with perfectly aligned volumes, some of which I had memorized in full. He spoke in measured tones about adjustments, expectations, review processes. I nodded at all the right moments, but then he said something that made the skin on my neck tighten. We've received concerns. I blinked. About what? Your demeanor, your tone during lectures. A few of your students feel you've become distracted, ambiguous. I tried to respond. I wanted to say something reassuring, but all I could manage was, I'm sorry if I've given that impression. He didn't look up from his notes. Be cautious, Mahir. Ambiguity is a dangerous form of rebellion. The word clung to me long after I left his office. Rebellion. I wasn't rebelling. I was still attending prayers, still leading students, still wearing the robe, still quoting the texts. But inside, it felt like my soul was splitting into two people, one who followed and one who watched. That evening, I opened my Quran and began reading aloud, as I often did after dinner. My voice echoed softly off the walls of the study, but something caught. A verse I had read 1,000 times. This time, it felt heavier, harsher. The words tasted metallic. I stopped midline. Outside the study, my wife called, "Are you all right?" I cleared my throat. Yes, but I wasn't. The next night, I dreamt again. This time I was standing in a field. The sky was overcast, and the ground beneath me was soft and wet, like recently tilled earth. In the distance, I saw a figure walking toward me. I couldn't make out the face, just a shape, white, slow, silent. As it approached, I felt both fear and calm rise in me like twin tides. The figure reached out a hand, not to strike, not to demand, but just to touch my shoulder. I woke up before contact. My pillow was damp. I didn't speak of it, not to my wife, not to anyone. But I started writing things down in a small notebook I kept hidden inside an old textbook. Questions I had never dared voice before. Not big, dramatic questions. Simple ones. Why do I feel afraid when I pray? Why do I never feel seen? Why is silence louder than recitation? One morning, I caught myself staring at a young man in the prayer hall. He was weeping softly during the final bow. Everyone else moved in unison, fluid, rehearsed. But this boy was shaking. I wondered what had broken in him to cause that kind of sorrow. Then I wondered what hadn't broken in me. I saw my reflection in the polished floor tiles. My face was composed, my eyes dry. Later that day, I visited my younger sister. We hadn't spoken much lately. Life had drawn us into different patterns. She was folding laundry as we talked, mundane things as families do. But something in her seemed distant, tighter. And then, as if from nowhere, she said, "Have you ever wondered why it's always fear first?" I looked up. "What do you mean?" In the teachings, in our home, in the way we're taught to approach God, it's always fear before love, wrath before mercy. She trailed off. I didn't know what to say. I gave her a familiar answer about reverence, about discipline. But even as I spoke, I felt the hollowness of my own words. She didn't challenge me. She just nodded and kept folding shirts. But when I left her home, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Shame. Not because I doubted, but because I had no answers, not even for myself. That night, the silence in my house felt thick. I sat at my desk, the pages of my Quran open in front of me, and I simply stared. I wasn't reading, I wasn't reflecting, I was waiting for something, a feeling, a thought, a sound, anything. Instead, I heard my own breath, unsteady, my own heartbeat, loud. I reached for the notebook and wrote just one line. I think something in me is breaking. I went to bed late. The window was open. The air was warm. I lay still, eyes on the ceiling, and whispered a sentence I didn't fully understand. Who are you, really? I wasn't looking for an answer. Not yet. But something had already shifted. That was only the beginning. I didn't know what was coming, but something had already broken inside me. And it would only get worse. It started with my sleep. I used to rest easily. My days were full, my rituals exact, and my mind, though often busy, had been trained to obey a certain rhythm. But after that message, short, anonymous, enough to make me check over my shoulder even in my own hallway, the nights stopped being quiet. The first dream came 3 days later. In it, I was walking through a long corridor lined with bookshelves. The light overhead flickered. I knew the place. It was a corridor at the seminary. But somehow, it felt wrong. The books were blank, no titles, no markings, just rows and rows of emptiness. As I walked, I heard my own footsteps echo too loudly. Then, a voice behind me whispered my name. Not angrily, not even loudly, just a whisper. Mahir. I turned. No one. I woke up with my heart racing and my shirt clinging to my back. It was 3:41 a.m. I got up, washed, and went to pray. I tried to steady my breath. I tried to remember what came after the second verse. My tongue fumbled. I sat back on my heels and stared at the floor for a long time. That was the first time I noticed it. I could recite scripture in front of hundreds. I could speak eloquently for hours. But alone in the dark, in silence, I couldn't finish a single prayer. Not without forgetting, not without stumbling, not without that buzzing in my head. In the morning, I avoided my wife's gaze. She poured tea, like always, soft and quiet. But she noticed. I saw it in the pause of her hand, the way she set the cup down too carefully. "You had that dream again, didn't you?" she asked. I froze. What dream? Her voice barely rose above the sound of the kettle. "You've been mumbling in your sleep, saying someone's name. I don't know who." I laughed, or tried to. "Probably just a student. I've been under pressure." She didn't press further, but she didn't smile either. That afternoon, I met with one of the elders from the seminary. He wanted to review the syllabus for the upcoming semester. We sat in his office, a heavy room that always smelled faintly of incense and worn leather. The shelves were filled with perfectly aligned volumes, some of which I had memorized in full. He spoke in measured tones about adjustments, expectations, review processes. I nodded at all the right moments, but then he said something that made the skin on my neck tighten. "We've received concerns." I blinked. "About what?" "Your demeanor, your tone during lectures. A few of your students feel you've become distracted, ambiguous." I tried to respond. I wanted to say something reassuring, but all I could manage was, "I'm sorry if I've given that impression." He didn't look up from his notes. "Be cautious, Mahir. Ambiguity is a dangerous form of rebellion." The word clung to me long after I left his office. Rebellion. I wasn't rebelling. I was still attending prayers, still leading students, still wearing the robe, still quoting the texts. But inside, it felt like my soul was splitting into two people, one who followed and one who watched. That evening, I opened my Quran and began reading aloud, as I often did after dinner. My voice echoed softly off the walls of the study. But something caught. A verse I had read 1,000 times. This time, it felt heavier, harsher. The words tasted metallic. I stopped mid-line. Outside the study, my wife called, "Are you all right?" I cleared my throat. Yes, but I wasn't. The next night, I dreamt again. This time I was standing in a field. The sky was overcast, and the ground beneath me was soft and wet, like recently tilled earth. In the distance, I saw a figure walking toward me. I couldn't make out the face, just a shape, white, slow, silent. As it approached, I felt both fear and calm rise in me like twin tides. The figure reached out a hand, not to strike, not to demand, but just to touch my shoulder. I woke up before contact. My pillow was damp. I didn't speak of it, not to my wife, not to anyone. But I started writing things down in a small notebook I kept hidden inside an old textbook. Questions I had never dared voice before. Not big, dramatic questions. Simple ones. Why do I feel afraid when I pray? Why do I never feel seen? Why is silence louder than recitation? One morning, I caught myself staring at a young man in the prayer hall. He was weeping softly during the final bow. Everyone else moved in unison, fluid, rehearsed. But this boy was shaking. I wondered what had broken in him to cause that kind of sorrow. Then I wondered what hadn't broken in me. I saw my reflection in the polished floor tiles. My face was composed, my eyes dry. Later that day, I visited my younger sister. We hadn't spoken much lately. Life had drawn us into different patterns. She was folding laundry as we talked, mundane things as families do, but something in her seemed distant, tighter, and then, as if from nowhere, she said, "Have you ever wondered why it's always fear first?" I looked up. "What do you mean?" "In the teachings, in our home, in the way we're taught to approach God, it's always fear before love, wrath before mercy. She trailed off. I didn't know what to say. I gave her a familiar answer about reverence, about discipline. But even as I spoke, I felt the hollowness of my own words. She didn't challenge me. She just nodded and kept folding shirts. But when I left her home, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Shame. Not because I doubted, but because I had no answers, not even for myself. That night, the silence in my house felt thick. I sat at my desk, the pages of my Quran open in front of me, and I simply stared. I wasn't reading, I wasn't reflecting, I was waiting for something, a feeling, a thought, a sound, anything. Instead, I heard my own breath, unsteady, my own heartbeat, loud. I reached for the notebook and wrote just one line. I think something in me is breaking. I went to bed late. The window was open. The air was warm. I lay still, eyes on the ceiling, and whispered a sentence I didn't fully understand. Who are you, really? I wasn't looking for an answer. Not yet. But something had already shifted. That was only the beginning. I didn't know what was coming, but something had already broken inside me, and it would only get worse. The day I opened my mouth was the day everything around me began to close. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even defiant. Just a question, half whispered, in a safe space I believed was still mine. I was in the teacher's lounge, sitting across from Sheikh Farid, my senior by 20 years. We were having the usual midday tea, steam curling between us, filling the silence that always settled after prayer. He had known me since I was a student. He'd once said I had a soul made for the pulpit. I used to believe him. That day, I tried to speak carefully. "Sheikh," I said, stirring the cup, though I had no intention of drinking. "Do you think it's normal to feel distant sometimes? From the words, from the ritual?" He didn't look up. "Doubt is a test," he said, as if reciting from a prepared response. I nodded. "But what if it's not doubt? What if it's silence? Like God is far, even when I'm obeying?" Now he looked up, not sharply, but his eyes changed. He studied me too long. "I hope," he said slowly, "that you are not reading outside the bounds of our tradition." "No," I lied. "Of course not." The silence stretched. Then he said, "Be very careful, Mahir. The heart strays long before the tongue does, but the tongue tells the world when it's too late." That was the end of our tea. He left the room without finishing his cup. I sat there, still stirring mine. It had gone cold. That afternoon, I returned to my office to find the door slightly open. On my desk, a small sticky note had been left, with one word scribbled in rushed handwriting. "Careful." No signature. I looked down the hallway. Empty. The next day, I was removed from the Friday schedule. No explanation. I asked one of the assistants. He avoided my eyes. "It's not personal," he said. "They're just adjusting the rotation." I wasn't naive. I had been trained in the language of silence. When people don't want to accuse you outright, they make you invisible instead. That week, I stopped sleeping again. At night, I paced the living room, barefoot, avoiding the creaking floorboards. My wife asked what was wrong. I told her I was thinking about a lesson plan. She didn't press, but I saw her watching me from the doorway, her fingers tugging at the end of her scarf. One night, I took out the old notebook and wrote down something I hadn't dared name. What if we've misunderstood God? I stared at the sentence for a long time. It looked heavier than I expected, like it might crack the page in half. That same night, I received a message on Telegram. Anonymous username. No avatar. The text simply said, "If you're awake, go listen. He's waiting." I stared at it for minutes. Then I deleted it. Then I opened it again. Then I clicked the link embedded in the message, even though every part of me screamed not to. It led to a video. Black screen. Soft voice. A man speaking in Arabic, but not like our scholars spoke. There was no tension in his words. He wasn't teaching, he was telling a story about a time when he cried out in an empty room and a presence came. Not with judgment, but with gentleness. He didn't name him, but I knew who he meant. I paused the video after 2 minutes and sat completely still. My hands were sweating. The video kept playing. The voice continued. Something in me wanted to shut it down, but I didn't. I let it finish. Then I sat in the dark, the screen now black again, and tried to breathe. The next morning, my lecture was canceled. Another change, another excuse. I tried to keep my voice steady when I asked why. The secretary said there had been concerns about clarity. I nodded, left the room. My chest felt tight. Later, I walked into the prayer hall and found 2 of my colleagues speaking in hushed tones. When I entered, they went silent. One of them nodded politely. The other didn't even look up. That was when I felt it. I was no longer one of them. I was being moved from the inside to the outside, inch by inch, without anyone saying a word. I kept praying, but the prayers felt like performance now. I watched the way others prayed, tight, clean, practiced. I felt like I was mimicking something I used to believe. That night, I stood in the courtyard behind our home. The air was still, heavy with heat. I looked up at the sky, cloudless, indifferent, and I whispered it. Jesus. Not as a question, not as a declaration, just a name. A sound I had been carrying like a pebble in my throat. I waited for something to happen. Lightning. Condemnation. Nothing came. Just wind and the smell of dry stone. But I felt seen. It terrified me. The next day, I found my wife crying in the kitchen. She tried to hide it, but her hands were trembling. I asked what was wrong. She looked at me for a long time and said, "I think someone came by the house while you were gone. I think they were watching." I didn't ask who. I already knew the answer. That night, I opened the notebook again and wrote, "I think I've already crossed a line I didn't see." I tried to focus on the Imam's voice during prayer the next day, but something he said caught in my chest. It stayed there like a splinter. I didn't know why, but I couldn't unhear it. He said, "Doubt opens the door to betrayal. A pure heart does not question." I left the prayer hall early, sat in my car with the engine off, just breathing. Then I whispered again, "Jesus, if you're real, why am I whispering?" The silence that followed didn't feel empty this time. It felt aware. I drove home in silence, hands steady, thoughts unraveling like threads pulled loose by an unseen hand. They hadn't accused me yet, but I could feel it in the air. My name was no longer safe in their mouths. And somewhere deep inside, I knew it wasn't going to stop here. I don't remember the exact moment I heard it. Not with my ears, not like a sound. It was more like a shift, a breeze in a room where no window was open, a whisper that settled behind the ribs and stayed there. It was late. My wife was asleep. The children, if I'm honest, I hardly remember hearing them laugh anymore. I'd stopped reading bedtime stories. I'd stopped playing the Quran on the speakers in the living room like I used to. I told myself it was fatigue. The world had felt so loud lately that I craved silence more than devotion. But it wasn't silence I found that night. It was him. The whisper didn't say a name. It didn't quote scripture. It didn't demand anything. It was like someone was in the room, breathing the same air I was, but without taking anything from me. No judgment, no sharp questions, just presence. And I was scared. Not the kind of fear I'd been raised to know. The fear of failure, of punishment, of shame. No, this fear was different. Holy, intimate. As if someone knew me before I said a word. I had installed a VPN weeks ago. At first, I used it to access online lectures from scholars abroad, a small act of rebellion already. But lately, my search history had shifted. I was reading stories, not teachings, not arguments, just stories, personal accounts of people who had once believed everything I did and then stopped, or started again in another direction. That night, after the whisper, or whatever it was, I opened a link I'd been avoiding. A forum post. Anonymous. The title was simple. He came to me in the silence. I clicked. It was written by a woman. Her words were plain, soft, unassuming. She didn't try to convince anyone. She just told it. How she had grown up memorizing sacred texts, covering her head, obeying the rhythm of her faith like breathing. And how one night, while folding laundry, she felt someone in the room. Not a ghost, not a fear, but someone. She didn't say his name until the end. Jesus. Just the name, standing alone, like a secret exhaled too late to take back. I stared at the screen. My palms were sweating. I couldn't stop thinking about her voice, as if it knew something I didn't. I read the story 3 times. Each time, the same line stung my eyes. He didn't answer my questions. He just held them with me. That sentence broke something, because that's what I wanted. Not arguments, not threats, not even forgiveness. Just someone to hold the questions with me without running away. The next day, I taught a small class. Only a few students came. They took notes like always. One boy, the quiet one, asked what it meant to know God. Not to believe, to know. I gave the formal answer, but inside I heard my own voice say, "You don't know. You want to, but you don't." That night I opened the App Store. My hands shook as I typed the name, Bible. I found one. Simple, discreet. I downloaded it and immediately deleted it from the screen, hiding it inside another folder. I had never done anything like that before. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe fire, maybe lightning, maybe that old fear to return and strike me back into line. But nothing came. I sat on the floor of my study, cross-legged like a child, and read the first words I saw. In the beginning was the Word. I closed the app immediately. My chest felt tight. What was I doing? What if someone saw? What if my children found it? What if I started believing something I couldn't unbelieve? I turned off the tablet, placed it face down, sat in the dark for a long time, but the words were still there, moving around inside me. Later that week, I walked into the study and found a book missing. One I'd been using to hide the notebook. It wasn't valuable, just familiar. But I panicked. I asked my wife if she had moved it. She hesitated, then said she hadn't noticed anything. I didn't believe her, not because she was lying, but because her eyes looked scared. She had seen something. I didn't press. That night, I locked the study door from the inside, and I whispered the name again, Jesus, just to see what would happen. And then, for the first time in years, I cried. Not from guilt, not from fear, but from relief, like someone had finally answered a question I hadn't dared to ask. The next day, I walked past the library downtown. I'd passed it 100 times without noticing, but now, one poster in the window caught my eye. A faded flyer for a literature event. Read freely, it said. I stood there staring at it like it was a commandment. I walked in, and in the back, tucked between shelves, I found a small book in English. Thin, old, the cover torn. It wasn't titled, but inside, it was the Gospel of Luke. I checked over my shoulder, then I slipped it into my coat and walked out. I wasn't proud of it. I wasn't rebellious. I was just hungry. I read it that night with the window cracked open, as if letting in the wind would keep me from suffocating. I didn't understand much. The names were strange. The stories didn't follow the structure I knew, but one sentence made me stop breathing. He reached out and touched him, saying, I am willing. Willing. I don't know why that word broke me. Maybe because I had lived a life trying to earn something from God, approval, safety, maybe even love. And here, someone simply was willing. I put the book down, pressed it to my chest, and for a moment, I didn't feel alone. That night, I had another dream. I was in a narrow hallway. No windows, just doors, closed, locked, endless. I ran my hand along the wall, looking for one that would open. At the end, there was a light under a door. I reached for the handle. When I opened it, there was no room, no walls, just sky, and a man standing there, facing away, wearing white. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. I knew it was him. I wanted to call his name, but I didn't have a voice. I woke up with my throat tight and tears running sideways into the pillow. The sun hadn't risen yet. I lay there in the dark and whispered, if it's really you, I'm still here. I didn't want to believe, but I couldn't look away. By the time I reached the end of the 3rd chapter, I realized I had stopped blinking. I was sitting in the corner of the study, knees drawn up, the room dark except for the narrow lamp above the desk. The gospel lay open in my hands, thin pages trembling slightly, as if my fingers had lost their strength. There was nothing loud in the words, no threats, no pressure, just stories. But they felt different from any I had ever taught. These stories seemed to look back at me, as if they knew me. I kept telling myself it was just research, curiosity, an intellectual detour. But I wasn't taking notes. I wasn't analyzing. I was reading like a man desperate for water, and every word I swallowed seemed to wake something aching inside my chest. Still, I was terrified. I would check the lock on the door 3, sometimes 4 times. I kept the curtains drawn. I listened for footsteps in the hallway, even though I knew my wife was asleep. I had started hiding the small book in a zippered pouch inside an old briefcase, one I hadn't used in years. It smelled of dust and dry leather. Somehow that made it feel safer, like the book couldn't burn me if I buried it deep enough in the past. But it didn't help. The words still followed me. One verse in particular had lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." I didn't understand what it meant. Not fully, but every time I recited the formal prayers, that sentence echoed louder than the ones I was trained to love. At first, I tried to balance both. I would do the morning prayer, then go back to bed and pull the gospel out from beneath the mattress. I would lead a study group at the seminary, then later that same night, listen to the voice of a woman from Canada speak on YouTube about meeting Jesus in her hospital room. I didn't know if she was telling the truth, but something in the way she said, "His name." It didn't sound like fantasy. It sounded like memory. My double life was quiet, but it was growing, and so was the fear. I knew what would happen if someone found out. Not publicly. No one would shout or threaten. They would simply stop returning my calls, remove my name from the schedule, take my words and turn them upside down. I'd be remembered as someone who lost himself, someone confused. They wouldn't say it aloud, but they'd make it clear. I had crossed the boundary. Some days, I thought of deleting everything, throwing the book away, deleting the apps, shutting the door tight and praying until the silence softened again. But it wouldn't. It never did. One night, I tried to go back. I sat on the prayer rug, lit the familiar incense, opened the Quran to the chapter I had memorized as a boy. The words came out, clear, perfect. I still knew the rhythm, but they felt empty. Not wrong, not false, just hollow. Like I was singing a melody I no longer believed in, only because I feared what would happen if I stopped. I stayed on the rug for an hour, staring ahead, waiting for something to move. In me, it didn't. Later that week, I heard my son humming something in the hallway, a tune I didn't recognize. I asked him where he learned it. He shrugged. "On YouTube," he said. "Some American woman singing about a shepherd." I felt my throat tighten. I told him to turn it off. I didn't yell, I just panicked. He looked confused, then guilty, then ashamed. I hated that look. I hated that I had passed my fear onto him without meaning to. That night, I sat in the study again and opened the gospel to the same place as before. The story of the man born blind. I had read it before, but this time, a line caught me off guard. He opened his eyes and said, "I see." I closed the book, pressed my palms over my face, breathed in deeply, and whispered, "I want that." I didn't mean physical sight. I meant inside. I wanted to see what was real. I wanted the noise to stop. I wanted to know whether I was losing my faith or finally finding it. A few days later, one of my colleagues approached me after prayer. He was polite, careful, smiling with his mouth, but not his eyes. "There are rumors," he said gently. "You've been reading outside." I kept my voice calm. "I read many things." He smiled. "Some books are doorways, others are cliffs." That was all he said, but I understood. I went home and packed a small bag, not to flee, but because something in me knew this season was ending. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, the gospel open in my lap, one hand resting on the pages, the other holding a cup of cold tea. I wasn't thinking about leaving religion. I wasn't thinking about joining another. I was thinking about him, and the strange, impossible hope that maybe he had been thinking about me too. Everything I believed was cracking, but nothing prepared me for what happened next. I wasn't praying when he came. I wasn't reading, fasting, weeping, or searching. I was just tired. It was the middle of the night, the kind where even the dogs don't bark and the air feels like it's waiting for something. I was sitting on the floor of the study again, back against the wall, knees drawn up. I had turned off the light an hour earlier, but hadn't moved since. The room was thick with heat and silence. Outside the window, the streetlight buzzed softly, casting a pale glow on the ceiling. I don't know why I whispered his name again. Jesus. It wasn't a plea or a confession. It was a sigh, the kind that slips out when you've run out of questions and don't expect answers anymore. And then it happened. At first, it felt like warmth, not in the air, in me. A slow, rising heat, not sharp, not urgent, but steady. It started in my chest, just below the collarbone, and moved outward. My fingers tingled. My breath slowed. I thought maybe I was falling asleep sitting up, the way children do after long days. But I was wide awake. Then came the light. Not bright, not blinding, just present. A soft, quiet radiance that didn't come from anywhere I could name. The kind of light that doesn't fall on things but opens them. It wasn't outside me. It wasn't inside me. It was between, around. And then I felt it. Him. A presence. Not imagined, not remembered, not summoned. He was there. I couldn't see his face. I didn't need to. I knew. Like you know the scent of someone you love before you turn the corner, like you know a voice before it speaks. I started trembling, not from fear, from recognition. He didn't speak with words, but I heard him. He didn't touch me with hands, but I felt him. He didn't ask anything of me, but he gave something. Instantly, fully, a knowing that I was seen, entirely, that nothing in me, no doubt, no failure, no hidden thread, had scared him away. I wept, not the kind of weeping that bends the body, not dramatic, just slow tears, rising steadily, falling quietly. My breath caught in my throat. My hands trembled in my lap. I couldn't move. I didn't want to. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reciting to fill the silence. I was resting in it. I didn't see scars. I didn't hear sermons. I didn't float or shake or fall over. But I felt his voice, like wind inside my bones, like the sound a tree makes just before it breaks open to the spring. And he said, or I heard, I don't know how to explain it, but it came clear. You are mine. That was it. No commands, no rebuke, just that. You are mine. And something in me, some ancient brittle piece I didn't know was still alive, broke, gently, like a shell opening to let the light in. I sat that way for a long time, when the presence faded. And it did, slowly, like fog dissolving in the morning sun. I didn't chase it. I didn't cry out, because it didn't leave me. It just shifted, from standing beside me to settling within. I lay on the floor, still trembling. The rug was rough beneath my cheek. My shirt stuck to my back with sweat. My lips were dry. My heart was so full it ached. I whispered, barely audible, "I believe you're real." I didn't understand him. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. But I knew I had met him. And somehow, impossibly, he had already known me. When I finally got up from the floor, the sun was starting to rise. The window panes glowed faintly orange. The house was silent. I walked to the sink and washed my face with cold water. My reflection looked back at me. Eyes swollen, cheeks damp, mouth soft. I looked different. Not new, just honest. I didn't say anything to my wife that morning. I couldn't, but when she looked at me over breakfast, something in her face changed. She didn't speak either, but she saw it. Later, as I walked to the mosque for the midday prayer, I felt the pull in my chest, that quiet resistance I'd known for weeks. But now it didn't feel like fear. It felt like a line I had already crossed. He had come, without noise, without proof, without warning, and everything I thought I needed, every ritual, every word, every control, had fallen quiet in the light of him. I didn't ask him to come again. I didn't need to, because he hadn't left. I didn't tell anyone, not right away. I carried that night like a breath I was afraid to exhale. Something too fragile to share, too holy to explain. I didn't trust my words to hold it. I barely trusted my own memory. Maybe I was protecting it from the world, or maybe from myself. But you can't keep something like that hidden for long, not when it's changed the shape of your silence. It started with my eyes. I noticed it the next morning as I passed a mirror in the hallway. I paused, not because I looked different. I didn't, but something in the way I met my own reflection had shifted. I wasn't evaluating. I wasn't adjusting my collar or smoothing my beard. I was just seeing myself fully, quietly. As if, for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what looked back. That same day, I entered the mosque for prayer. Everything was the same. Same shoes outside, same muted greetings, same soft rustle of robes and prayer beads. But my body felt out of rhythm. The motions felt foreign, like I was stepping into a story I no longer believed was mine. I still bent, I still whispered, but inside, I was listening for a voice that didn't live in that room. After prayer, one of the elders approached me. "You've been quiet," he said. "People are noticing." I nodded. "I've just been thinking." His face remained calm, but his tone sharpened. "Some thoughts are better left unspoken. You understand?" I smiled politely. "Of course." He patted my shoulder, the way you do when someone is on their way out but doesn't know it yet. That evening, I didn't go home. I took a long walk instead, through narrow streets I hadn't visited in years, past the park where I used to push my children on the swing, past the bookstore with the dusty window I'd once stared into. The city hadn't changed, but I had. I could feel it in the way I looked at things. Less as landmarks, more like memories already dissolving. When I finally reached home, the house was dark. My wife was sitting on the edge of the bed, her back to me. She didn't turn when I entered. "You missed dinner," she said. "I know. You've been missing a lot." I didn't answer. She turned then. Her eyes were dry but swollen. She didn't speak for a moment, and when she did, her voice was steady. "Are you going to tell me what's happening?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. She waited. Finally, I said it. I saw him. Her face didn't move. Not right away. Then her eyes widened, not in fear, but in something slower. Grief, recognition, as if she had known, somehow, before I spoke. "In a dream?" she asked. "No," I whispered. "Here, with me, awake." She pressed her hand to her mouth, not in shock, in surrender. "I knew," she said. "I knew something was different." We didn't speak again that night. She lay down, facing away. I stayed sitting, watching the moonlight slide across the floor like a slow, pale tide. The next morning, I found an envelope by the front door. No name, no stamp. Inside, one piece of paper. "He is no longer one of us." Nothing else, no threat, no accusation, just erasure. I stood holding it for a long time, then folded it, placed it inside my notebook, went to the kitchen, made tea. I didn't cry, I didn't panic. I just felt still, like something had settled in me that no wind could shake loose. Later that week, I received a message from a former student. No greeting, just a line. "They've removed your name from the faculty list." I responded with a thank you. He replied with an emoji, a broken heart. I didn't open the website to check. I didn't need to. That evening, I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at my wife. "I don't expect you to follow me," I said. "I don't even know where I'm going yet, but I can't stay here, not like this." She nodded, slowly. Then she whispered, "I saw him too. Before we married, I never told anyone." We didn't speak again after that, but her hand found mine beneath the blanket, and I wept. Not out of sadness, not even out of joy, but because I knew we had just crossed a line we couldn't return from. The next morning, I packed a small bag, not out of fear, not as a fugitive, but as someone who no longer belonged where he once stood. I left behind my titles, my robes, my study materials. I left behind the books I had once taught, the praise I had once craved, the rituals that had once kept me safe. I took only the gospel and a shirt that still smelled of cedar from my old office. I walked quietly, past neighbors who didn't look up, past men who used to rise when I entered the room. No one said a word. That was the loudest part. I didn't feel anger, only sorrow, the kind that doesn't need words. I stepped into the street as the sky turned gold with morning, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel lost. Not because I had found something, but because he had found me. And now I knew I could never be unheard again. The room was small. One window, thin curtains, a wooden chair in the corner, and a narrow bed with a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and old cotton. There was nothing holy about the space. No candles, no crosses, no echo of sacred songs. Just stillness. Just breathe. Just me. I hadn't spoken in hours. Not from sorrow, not from tension, just quiet. It felt like the world had finally stopped trying to answer questions I no longer needed to ask. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to change, that slow, deliberate shift before dusk. When the world holds its breath and everything turns softer, bluer. I sat on the chair, feet bare, gospel in my lap, spine slightly curved like I was bowing without knowing it. My hands rested on the open pages. I wasn't reading, I was listening. Not to words, to presence. I had left everything. Not in one day, not with a door slammed or a letter burned. Just one thread at a time. A schedule dropped, a name removed, a silence lengthened. I had become invisible. And then, finally, free. There was no roadmap for what came next, no mentor to follow, no ritual to lean on. But I wasn't afraid anymore, because I knew he was still here. I had felt him every morning since that night. Not as a voice, not even as a feeling, just nearness. The way you know someone is in the room before they speak. A warmth behind the ribs. A breath that doesn't belong to you. Some days I spoke to him out loud. Some days I didn't say a word, but he heard either way. I kept thinking I would feel guilt, that the weight of everything I had left behind would crash over me in waves. But it never did. The pain came, yes, for my family, for the loss, for the silence between people who used to speak freely. But not guilt, not shame. It was like walking out of a thick fog and realizing the world had colors you hadn't seen before. One afternoon, I walked by a small chapel. I didn't go in. I stood on the other side of the road, hands in my pockets, watching a woman sweep the steps. She looked up and smiled. Not in recognition, just in kindness. That alone almost undid me. I think I stayed there 10 minutes, maybe longer. Then I turned and walked on. I wasn't ready for churches yet. Maybe I never would be. What I had wasn't about buildings or names or songs. It was him, and he had already met me in a room with no altar. A room where all I had was silence and a book I wasn't supposed to own. Some nights I would lie awake and wonder what my students thought of me now, if they ever whispered my name the way people speak of those who disappeared, if they repeated stories, if they remembered my lessons, if any of them had begun to feel the same cracks I once did. I hoped so. Not so they would suffer, but so they would one day stop feeling alone. That evening, as the light faded from the sky, I moved to the window, opened it halfway, let the warm air in. It smelled like evening bread and jasmine from a nearby courtyard. I didn't speak, just placed the gospel gently on the sill. My fingers traced the worn edge of the cover. I didn't need to open it. I knew the words I wanted were already inside me. I closed my eyes, breathed in, and finally said it. Not loudly, not for the world to hear, not as a banner, not as a vow, just as a truth that had waited too long to be named. Jesus, I believe. And I stayed there. No thunder, no vision, just peace. Not the kind that promises answers, the kind that promises presence. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. I didn't understand it all, but I knew this. I wasn't alone anymore.